This conference will now be recorded.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Father Sinclair with Doreen Batto with the Apostleship of the See of the United States of America, and also myself with the Apostleship of the See of the Diocese of Beaumont. And I want to welcome in a very special way our guests today, and hopefully that this will become a regular series between AOS Beaumont and AOS-USA of interviewing important people within the maritime community. And with me today is Robert Frump, who has written a number of important books. The first experience I had with him was Until the Sea Shall Free Them, which is the story of the Marine Electric. Then just the last couple of months, I read his book, The Captains of Thor, which is very interesting interpretation of all the activities that were going on in regards to the Faro incident. And I've just gotten it, but I haven't read it yet. Two Tankers Down, which was told in the movie The Glorious Moment or something like that.
Finest Hours.
Pardon?
The Finest Hours was
Finest Hour. Finest Hour. Yeah, the religious people do glory things. So the Finest Hour, which I haven't read yet, but hopefully we can touch upon this thing also. Now, before I begin, I want to read from page 59 to 60 of his book, Until the Sea Shall Free Them. And this is talking about the protagonist in this book, the chief mate Cusick. And Robert writes there, then one Sunday, when the Biles was loading oil in Port Arthur, Texas, Cusick went to the matinee movie. Midway through, the projector ground to a halt. The lights went on. The movie manager rushed into the theater and yelled that all the servicemen and merchant mariners must return to their posts. The Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor. And so a number of years ago, whenever I read that, it's like, oh, well, that's really cool because I'm born and raised here in Port Arthur. And where we were sitting right here at the Port Arthur International Seafarer Center, this movie that he was at was about 5 blocks from us as part of the history things. And then I'll go on because Doreen has just razzed me to no end about my dead seaman wall. And that's S-E-A-M-A-N, by the way, my dead seaman wall, because in the research that I've done, especially during the Second World War, that there were 34 ships that were sailing to or from the Golden Triangle, Beaumont, Port Arthur, that were attacked by German U-boats, and most of them, or many of them, were sunk. And in fact, the Biles, so this is December of 1941, December 7th of 1941. In April of 1942, the Biles was attacked by a German submarine and was, I think it was sunk at that point. Fortunately, all 37 or so crew members at that point were off. But there's this intersectionality that takes place in these discussions that all of a sudden I'm reading this book about a ship that sinks in the Atlantic, and the chief mate who actually begins his career as a mariner is on one of his first port of calls is here in the city of Port Arthur. So found that just very, very fascinating to come across. So Robert, tell me a little bit about yourself and how did you get engaged into this maritime community and the writing?
Well, as you know, there's kind of a slow entrance and initiation. It's not a community that trusts outsiders a lot. I think of it as facing away from the nation, looking out towards things that other people don't see, but also being somewhat suspicious and a little dubious of landlubbers. My beginnings on it were as a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I had covered a lot of Democratic politics. I'd done a lot of investigative reporting, and I'd reached a point in time where I had experienced about all the romance of political coverage that I could stand.
Especially in Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia machine.
Yes. So, well, there was a very colorful mayor at the time named Frank Rizzo, who was kind of a predecessor of Donald Trump in many ways. A very charismatic fellow. It was very exciting to cover him, but I came out of that wanting to do something completely different. And the executive editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer was a former Maritime reporter. And he had been trying to get someone to cover Maritime for years. And people saw it as sort of a throwaway beat. And in some ways, that's exactly what I was looking for. I was looking for something that did not have 6 editors staring over my shoulder, that I could spend time on, develop issues. And it didn't hurt that the head of the newspaper also wanted it to succeed. So I thought hard about that versus other beats such as environment or Washington Bureau was an option. And a lot of people did not understand why I took this beat over something that probably would be considered a little sexier. But I was trying it out, and I went down to the Packer Avenue terminal in Philadelphia at night as a part of a story, and I was standing near the Delaware River, and I heard this whooshing from far away, and I looked up, and there was a huge tanker coming downriver. It's a big tanker port. It had some sort of Chinese lettering and name on it, and there were 4 or 5 fellows on the railing staring at me as I was staring back at them. And it just, I don't know if you can fall in love with the beat, but at that point, that very point in time, that just spoke to me of such potential in terms of humans, in terms of reaching out across the world. I didn't know all of the issues that were involved at that time, but suspected that there were a number. But that was kind of it for me. Zing went the strings of my heart, and I never looked back and never regretted it. It was a wonderful beat. Over about a year, I think I won the trust of the local people in Philadelphia, and that's wasn't completely easy to do because I did not roll over on issues. I was and am a fairly tough reporter, but I think they understood that I was fair, and I was pretty much accepted in as a constructive part of the community there, even though I would often raise a critical voice.
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
That's my origin legend.
Yeah, and you talk about being a tough reporter, and I see 2 things that take place. Either an approach that takes place, and we see this within sort of the maritime ministry, and that is that the seafarers are these guys that we have to take care of because that they for a number of reasons that we've got to take care of them, and we can't really expect that they're going to do what they're supposed to do because they're seafarers. So you're sort of being this very matriarchal type of response to them. Where on the other hand, especially you see this coming from the environmental community, is like these are the guys that are waiting just to destroy the entire environment by everything that they do. So there's certainly questions that can be raised, but at the same time, these are not children. They've managed to take $100 million ship loaded with millions of dollars of cargo and go from Korea through the Panama Canal without hitting the locks, and then come to Port Arthur or come to Philadelphia on the first try. They didn't go like to Jacksonville. Oh, this is in Philadelphia, and then they just sort of bounced their way up until they finally found Philadelphia. They found it on the first effort that was there. And so having that strong personality is really a fair personality is really important. So how did you get engaged first with the Marine Electric?
That started off with another ship called the SS Poet, and the Poet sailed out of Philadelphia in 1980. I think I was covering the last game of the World Series for the Inquirer because they expected riots to break out if Philadelphia won, which they were going to win. So I was actually on assignment the final game of the World Series. But the poet was carrying corn to Egypt, as I recall, under a federal program, and it sailed out of Philadelphia and just disappeared. The owner waited 7 days to report the ship missing. I probably would not have paid as much attention to it as I did, except for two reasons. One was there was a Philadelphia police detective who was auxiliary Coast Guard and had inspected the ship, and he was telling our police reporters that the ship was a mess. The second was just a remarkable group of parents and siblings of the crew members who weren't about to let it go, and they weren't about to let me go either. They really were. I was, I think at the time, sort of a callous journalist, and you get used to as a crime reporter. There's just not much to do. And I had reported the ship missing and almost certainly lost. And I got a call from Lottie Fredette, who was the mother of one of the crewmen who chewed me out in a wonderfully accented German American that had almost a lilt to it. And she said, "Hey, Mr. Frump, who are you to tell us to lose hope and that our children are dead? What's the matter? Why aren't you out there helping us?" And I took the point. I took the point, and there wasn't anything I could do to save the crew, of course. And in fact, my reporting was correct. After 10 days, it's very unlikely that you're going to find signs of survivors, and the ship was totally lost, never ever found to this day. But then what I started to do was to inquire into it, and as I did, in my head I was thinking, well, what would cause an American flag ship to sink? And I had in my mind at that time, early in the beat, of American flag ship being sparkling white, chrome and brass glinting with the American flag flying proudly above it. And what I found instead was that the poet was 40 years old. It was 1980, and this was a World War II surplus ship, a converted troop ship that was in horrible condition, and that the owner was running a series of ships that were even in worse condition. And they were at sea for two reasons. One, there were American programs that subsidized it and paid you to haul the corn to Egypt, Africa, many places throughout the world. And secondly, the inspection process it just gave them a pass. Just out and out gave them a pass. And so that was the first leg of it. And the most dismaying part of that, where it really got my attention, was there are Marine Board of Investigation hearings into these sinkings that are run by the Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board. And I attended that, and it just felt like such a whitewash. You had the attorneys for the officers basically laying out all these things about the history of the ship, the history of the other ships, and the Coast Guard and NTSB is taking this very narrow view of, well, we can't look at the other ships, we can only look at the poet, and there's really no record of it being in bad shape. They dismissed the detective as someone who really wasn't knowledgeable of the sea, didn't graduate from the Coast Guard Academy, and he was sort of poo-pooed. Dead men tell no tales. The crew wasn't there to say. If you had served on the port and you stepped forward, you most likely would risk your job at a time when jobs were scarce, as they always are. And not only would you disappoint the owners, you're likely to disappoint your colleagues and your union members. It's a tough business. We know there are risks in these ships, but at least they're jobs and they put food on the table. So why are you ruining this for us by basically saying that the ships are unsafe? And that was the sort of culture and the sort of dynamic that was at play. And that's what really started it for me. At the time, for the Philadelphia Inquirer, I did an initial story about the poet that basically said, here's what's happening, here's what bad shape they're in, and if you don't do something about that, it's gonna happen again. Unfortunately, I was correct. The SS Marine Electric sailed out of Norfolk to the Boston area in February of 1983, carrying coal. It too was a leftover World War II ship that was sailing long after its prime. Most ships are built to last 20 years. The Marine Electric was close to 40 years. It had its hatches signed off on and inspected by a Coast Guard inspector when the hatches weren't even on the ship. They were miles away out for repair, but it was such a rubber stamp that they approved hatches that they'd never seen. Now, the thing about the Marine Electric is this dead men tell no tales what survivors do. And there were 3 survivors out of 34 in the Marine Electric. Miraculously spent hours in this cold water and were eventually rescued. And one of them was Bob Cusick, who was the chief mate. And Cusick was something of a pack rat in saving his notes, all the drawings that he'd done of every crack in the hatch. He turned that over to the captain, which was the proper procedure. The captain and the company did nothing about it. So the hatches were in such bad shape that the men wouldn't walk on them because they were afraid that they would fall through. There were cracks in the hull that they jokingly outlined in white paint with arrows on them pointing toward them, and watched the Coast Guard inspectors step over them without looking at them. What had brought this in it wasn't just a situation where the Coast Guard didn't care. They had for years been pressing safety stuff, but the pressure from Congress, the pressure from their own administration was, just keep the ship sailing. We know they're in bad shape, but we have to leave it to the owners to decide when they go out or when they stop service. So in Marine Electric's viewpoint, in many ways, Marine Transport Lines was one of the better operations, and they were in fact building a new ship, which was rare because it's so expensive to build a new ship in America. But they were building a new ship that would replace the Marine Electric, but it was slightly behind schedule, and so they asked the Coast Guard for a waiver on a dry dock hull inspection for the Marine Electric, so they could go out one more time. And that was the culture of one more time. One more time could last 5 to 10 years. In this case, it was one last time. As near as anyone can tell, what happened is that the ship that ran into a bad storm helped rescue a fishing boat. It was really battered by high winds, and the hatch covers most probably gave way. When that happens, the water gets into the hull. They were finding that the ship went down at the bow, down at the head, and wasn't responding. They called in a distress call to the Coast Guard. When they were in the middle of abandoning ship, Bob Cusick actually was swinging the lifeboat over the side when the vessel capsized. And as Cusick said, it was like the sound of water going down your bathtub drain, only a billion times louder. So all of these guys found, and they were all guys at that time, unlike the El Faro, but all of these guys suddenly were in water that was actually below freezing because it was salt water with a lower freezing point. It was, I think, a wind chill factor of minus 15 degrees. You don't live very long in a situation like that unless you get into a lifeboat or a raft. One of the seamen, a guy named Paul Dewey, was able to climb into a raft. But what he found is that he and the others could not get the others into the raft. They were so seized with hypothermia, and the life raft was a slick surface. It had a net down the side that supposedly you could use, but their fingers were so cold they couldn't do it, and he couldn't. He tried pulling these poor fellows in and just could not do it, and they started slowly drifting away. The third mate, Eugene Kelly, actually, as the ship was sinking, he came upon a pile of life preservers and started hurling them like discus out into the water, and then got caught in the capsizing. He swam free of the ship and actually found one of those life preservers, which presumably he had more or less thrown to himself. And they had a situation where 9 people had found the life preserver, so they were all holding on to the same preserver with the life vests, trying to keep people involved and alert and everything. But one by one, they started drifting off in the cold till there were only 2 left. Kelly heard helicopters, turned to the other fellow on the ring to tell him that the rescuers had arrived, and Kelly found that he was the last guy standing, floating, so to speak. Cusick swam away from the vessel, afraid that it would sink, and vacuum everyone down into it. He found a lifeboat that was broken and submerged, but he was able to hoist himself into that, and that got him somewhat out of the water. The other thing that helped him was his wife had knitted him a wool hat and given him what at that point was a state of the art waterproof a jacket with insulation that, unlike down, stayed good while it was wet. So he had almost like a wetsuit on. He found himself fading. He reached down really and began singing this sea ballad by a Canadian named Stan Rogers about the Mary Ellen Carter, which was an old ship that had sunk, but the crew decided to raise it. And the chorus line was "Rise Again." Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what got Bob through that. It's amazing that it really does affect me emotionally nearly 40 years later. But that's if if that wasn't a gift from God, Bob did not know what it was. He spent nearly 3 hours, I think almost 4, in the water, and life expectancy would have been about 40 minutes for hypothermia to set in. The other big lesson from the marine electric, and one of the major reforms that came from it was the method of rescue. Because although Kelly was pulled up by a helicopter and Dewey was saved by a helicopter and Cusick eventually was saved by a helicopter, most of those guys, or all of those other folks, died in part because the Coast Guard helicopter that arrived did not have a rescue swimmer. There was only a basket that they could lower, and after 15 minutes in that water, you would lose your ability to crawl into the basket. So they didn't know whether they were hauling in live people or dead people, and mostly it was dead people. The Navy sent out a chopper, and they had a history of rescue swimmers, primarily from their experience with aircraft carriers, where they would have a chopper launched and ready during takeoffs and landings, just in case someone went into the vent. So the Navy swimmer was able to pull in a number of people, and Kelly in particular probably would not have survived had the swimmer not lifted him into the basket. But that was basically the wreck of the Marine Electric and the rescue of the Marine Electric. The Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation was very different than the Poet, in part largely because of one man, and that was Captain Dominic Felicio. And Dom had been a merchant seaman captain and had enlisted in the Coast Guard and was a respected safety inspector. And someone in DC and Coast Guard headquarters, I think, decided that it was time to put a real investigation together. And Dom, along with the other Coast Guard investigators, really shredded most of the evidence that the Marine Transport Alliance presented to attempt to exonerate itself. The testimony of Cusick, Dewey, and Kelly also was crucial because Bob had all of these drawings. He'd even taken samples of the hatch covers back to his garage and brought them in his briefcase. So at one point, the ship attorney was Riley, frustrated. He'd ask Bob these questions, and Bob would say, "Oh yeah, no, they were definitely corroded. You know, they're corrugated. I have a piece right here in my briefcase if you'd like to see." And the ship attorney said, "No, thank you, Mr. Cusick. By the way, what else might you have in your briefcase?" He was just a very effective witness, to the point where the opposing attorney was even acknowledging it. But what happened as a result of this was a historic shift in safety standards. The Marine Board of Investigation faulted Marine Transport Lines, recommended that they be prosecuted. They pled guilty to a felony charge of not following safety guidelines. As a result of the investigation, the Coast Guard formed its now famous Coast Guard Rescue Swimmers program. There was a requirement that there be Gumby suits, that the survival suits be on all North Atlantic ships. And perhaps most importantly, the Coast Guard took the gloves off of the inspectors and told them, yeah, no, you can do your job now. And the result was that nearly 70 old ships were scrapped. So when they put the real standards to the ships, that was the result. And as a result of that, there was a period of nearly 30 years where there were no major American ship casualties.
You mentioned this, and as you're telling the story, there's a number of parallels between something that's very, very close to us here in Port Arthur, Beaumont, and that's the loss of another Marine ship, and that's the Marine Sulphur Queen. Parallels. I think she was actually sailing from Beaumont to Philadelphia, with a load of sulfur.
Yep.
Again, the crew was constantly going down there because the sulfur tanks were cracking and they were bleeding molten sulfur into the tween spaces, and so I had to go in and clean that stuff out. The company was building a new ship to replace her, but it wasn't quite there yet. And then, as you said in the poet, it's the same thing. She disappears. They eventually conclude she disappears around the Florida Straits, but they wait like 7 days when she's supposed to show up in Philadelphia before that they declare that, well, maybe she's lost at that point. And again, there was no message that came out. The last message that came out appears to have been a phone call from one of the crew members on the Marine operator phone system, probably shortly before after she left Port Arthur, sometime in the afternoon, or excuse me, in Beaumont, after she got out in the Gulf. And that call took place, and that was the last thing that was ever heard from her. There was interesting information in the paper that there was speculation that the ship had actually been hijacked by Fidel Castro and the Cubans. And so there was some investigation if the ship was in Havana, that it wasn't there. It had already been lost at that point. But you see these parallels that were there. And in reading your book on the Faro, reading the Coast Guard report on that thing, it seems like we went back to the bad old days again.
Yeah. I mean, the Marine Sulphur Queen was interesting in that in that one, there really was a top Marine Board of Investigation. I think one of the few remnants of the ship that they found on the Marine Sulphur Queen was, this is close to an exact quote, life jacket with teeth marks of predatory fish.
Yep.
So
the speculation is that the bridge watch, maybe the mate and the AB, became aware that something was going bad real quickly, and then they put on their life jackets and went aboard. But then, because the long delay, the Marine Sulphur Queen, all they found was a part. You can place the entire debris on a 6-foot table. Life jacket, a part of the name board, and a few other pieces is all.
Yeah. But yeah, it was very, the Marine Sulphur Queen was unique in that the actual Coast Guard Board of Marine Inspection was very tough. And it said, basically, we got to get rid of all these World War II ships. The T2 tankers were flawed. There was at an atomic molecular level. The steel was brittle, and it reacted in cold water. It was like crystal. It didn't flex. It broke. And the Marine Board said, you got to stop this. And the Commandant said, nah, we can't.
Yeah, all right.
Because it would have wiped out the American fleet. It really would have. That's how predominant the old World War II ships were. Yes, the Faro was the vessel that broke the Marine Electric safety record. And my reporting basically showed that, somewhere in there, in probably the early 2000s, the inspection standards again started to slip. Now, there's some speculation of, okay, well, everything within the Coast Guard got, as did everything in the rest of the world, got pointed towards terrorism, rightly inspecting cargo, and less and less on inspection. Whatever the case was, that slipped. And a private inspection agency, a nonprofit that's located in Houston, called the American Bureau of Shipping, was also conducting far more inspections than ever before. And that was a key thing out of the Marine Electric that said American Bureau of Shipping missed so many things. They should never be allowed to inspect another ship. The Coast Guard needs to do it. And the Commandant, for all the reforms that came from the Marine Electric, that was not one of them. The Commandant said, no, we have to keep the ABS, the American Bureau of Shipping. Well, by the time the Faro was sailing, studies showed that the American Bureau of Shipping was missing 38% of safety violations. And the Faro was no World War II ship, but she was by that time. She was built in the 70s. She was by that time, again, over 40 years old and well past the useful life of most ships. And the some of the key things there that you could see on the sister ship were that there were these sort of air ducts. The El Faro was built originally as a roll-on, roll-off vessel, built for speed. Military liked that because they could use it for tanks and other vessels, and so they heavily subsidized the building of it. The El Faro, under its earlier name, Northern Lights, participated in the Second Persian Gulf War, unloaded material while they were passing it.
Airport out there and loaded.
Yes, exactly. And all of that. But what happened was, when the ship was just very old, and these vents that were, you had to have these vents designed, taking huge amounts of air, because of the ro-ros where you put 1,000 vehicles perhaps with exhaust running, loading them onto the ship and then unloading them. You had to have those heavy duty exhaust or exhaust intake rather, so that people could live while they were loading and unloading. Well, over time, those exhausts or those intakes corroded, but they weren't fixed. They weren't. They also weren't closed. Now, when the ship was the Northern Lights, those intakes were high enough above the water that it didn't really matter. But the Coast Guard allowed the vessel to modify and become a hybrid ship, part container, part ro-ro, and that lowered it 2 feet in the water. The other thing that happened is that the containers gave the ship sail. So at in high winds, it could dip the corroded intakes underneath the water. And that's essentially what the Coast Guard concluded in the El Faro of one of the major factors. The other major factor is that the captain really was taking risks that he almost certainly should not have. A lot of people, I think, just kiss off the El Faro as, oh, crazy captain. He had the reputation of being a fairly cautious guy, but he was under a lot of pressure. He had been fired from one job because he called in tugboats because he didn't think the ship was safe. he was fired the next day because of the extra expense. He knew that if he didn't please the company, he was out of work in December. He was sailing in September, October, and so he definitely wanted to bring the cargo in on time. He could have diverted through what's called the Old Bahama Passage, which would have put some islands between the ship and the hurricane. And if I didn't mention that, of course, there was this hurricane that was
Yeah, the small hurricane.
Not something you want to leave out of the tale. But he had earlier in the year, he had diverted down the Old Bahama Passage just to avoid swells of a tropical storm. And you couldn't say that he was disciplined for it, but certainly there was displeasure showed by the company managers with, emails are funny things these days. So in one sense, it was, when do you plan to arrive? And that can be taken as a polite query, but then when it's got question marks and exclamation marks behind it from management, that's something more than a query. That's at the very least a slap on the wrist. So for whatever reasons, he persisted. The thing that I'm sorry, go ahead.
Very important point here. You know, we see this over and over again, and especially as communication gets better. For liability, oh yes, the captain's in charge of everything and is liable for everything, absolutely everything. So whatever happened, it's the captain's fault. Well, we saw this with the oily water separators, that the companies would get tagged for bypassing and having the magic pipe in the engine room. They get tagged for it. Well, it's the chief engineer and the captain's fault. Well, you know, company, you wouldn't pay to discharge this waste oil. Company, you know, you tell the captain to save money wherever he can. You know, all these things, that the message gets sent that, captain, you are not in charge. We saw after, I guess it was, I guess with Open 90 and then some of the other regulations that came after that, a real reluctance of masters to become tanker masters. I guess it was Casco Buson maybe when that happened, where all of a sudden you're getting arrested because you have a civil accident, but you're the captain of the ship, so it's all your fault in the process. And these things just happen over and over and over and over again.
Right. Yeah, the title of the book, The Captains of Thor, kind of plays off that. In there, there's a passage from an online post that calls the captains in the Alaska area. You know, I see you up there, you captains of Thor. You hammer through those waves, you know, at full speed when you don't really need to. And the image of the captain of Thor to me is good in that, you know, if you're the captain on the ship, you have that hammer, and when you drop that hammer, things shake, at least theoretically. And as the captain of the Faro found was when at another company he dropped that hammer and called in tugboats. Yes, he was master of his fate for that day, and then he was fired. You can't be a captain of Thor if you don't have a ship, and that's the dilemma that a lot of captains are in. And you're absolutely right from a liability standpoint. Some lines are better than others, but in this case, it really was a case of them, hands off. No, we trust our captains. We hire professionals to the point where they really had no guidelines at all. At the point of this hurricane sweeping through the Caribbean, they were unaware of it. They were one of the chief executives ironically was at a safety meeting, a convention on safety at sea. The recourse the captain had when it seemed inevitable that the ship was really in trouble, was he called a hotline, and this is recorded. It feels like you're calling Comcast cable service. I'm sorry, sir, I'll have to put you on hold. You can feel the frustration of the captain saying, the clock is ticking, ma'am. Can you please put me through? But there really wasn't anything to do at that time. What had happened is that the ship had flooded, probably through those exhausts, or those intakes rather. It had healed over. The engine oil in the sump had reached a level that basically shut the engine off. So the ship was.
Let me stop you there, because this is a point that I don't understand.
Yes.
Because first, I think in your book you reveal that they sailed with about 3 or 4 inches of lube oil low.
Yes.
That the manual called for like 27 inches or whatever,
Yes.
and they were about 3 or 4 inches below that.
Yes.
But on the ships that I've sailed on, the engine room always has lube oil in barrels, sitting there waiting for changing or whatever, adding or whatever. I never understood why they didn't add lube oil to it to bring it up above the intake.
It's a good question. I think that as I recall questioning folks on this, the lube oil was short, but they didn't think that in itself was causative. In that the list was bad enough that even had it been filled to the max, it still would have been dry. So very possibly that's why they didn't, or I'm not certain. And a lot of these ships, the engineers were fairly new to the ship. A lot of the officers were new to the ship. It's a good point. It's a good point. It gives me an unanswered question to
Robert,
ask.
before we run out of time,
I'd like to ask a question on the human side of things. Your books are definitely about the mechanics of what took place, but they're also about the human stories. And I can see that you're affected by these, and thankfully you are.
Yeah.
You mentioned coming from the type of work that you did before with criminal investigations, that you could have been very cold and hardened by this, but you're not. And I just wonder that when you're speaking to the families, how have these books helped them? How does it make you feel to help bring to life what happened, so that those families have some sense of closure, and not just the families, but the other crew members that they work with, even the companies that they work with. We know a lot of people related to the Faro, company people, union people. We know this affected them very much so. So how does it feel for you to be part of bringing this story to life?
Well, I think first and foremost, it humanized me a lot, because I really, back in 1980, I was pretty much a hardened journalist, and immune to most of these things. So it certainly affected me. And honestly, I'm surprised that I had that reaction. But I also think that in my career, I've never written anything that's really good unless I have that sort of emotional connection and reaction to it. I feel like then I better understand and actually know the subject matter in a different way. For me, I still have friends and family members, like the mothers of the SS Poet. Each year, on the anniversary of the ship sailing, take the Cape May Lewis ferry from New Jersey to Delaware and throw wreaths and flowers over. I've accompanied them a few times, and I'm still in regular contact with them. Bob Cusick and his wife, both dead now, became fast friends. His daughter Carol remains a fast friend. What I've been able to give to them, I'm not sure. I think that there's a real emotional connection with the book, particularly Until the Sea Shall Free Them, that resonates within the industry, because I think I got a lot of these things right, and I was able over time to have, and fortunate enough to have people open up to me and to tell the stories. The head of the Marine Board of Investigation, Jason Neubauer, Captain Jason Neubauer, in a conversation we had about the Faro, said that in his experience, particularly where there are ships sunk where the bodies are never found, the people turn to our social institutions, the Marine Board investigation, for example, to find closure. And I think he's absolutely right about that. I think it does in some way give them closure. And in other ways, it does not, because it's such a unique situation. If you've lost someone at sea and you're not able to say goodbye to them in the way that you normally would. But I like to think that I've helped give closure, if there honestly is such a thing on some of these matters, or at least, if not closure, at least comfort that there's attention paid and there's justice at least noted, not in all cases delivered, but noted. So that's been very important to me. It's also been important to me to explain it in terms of the industry itself. I'm a firm believer as a journalist that if I simply explain my opinions, or if I go out on my own personal crusade, it's going to feel good to me, but it's not going to change that many minds. But if I put it in terms where my worst critic has to admit, you guys got a point there, then you get shame. I have not had many if any people arguing the points that were made in Until the Sea Shall Free Them, or Captains of Thor. So I think that's been an important lesson to me as a journalist and a writer as well.
You touched upon bringing closure, and we actually experienced that ourselves here at the Port Arthur Seafarer Center back in 2016. We lost the Texaco, Oklahoma in 1971. But exactly 5 years before that, the Gulf Stag, the pump room blew up on the Gulf Stag. And actually, you read the report, and there's just all these mistakes that take place there during the actions and the management of cargo and all that type of stuff. But she blows up, and there were, I believe, 7 crew members who were killed, and most of them were lost because the ship was eventually lost. And there had never been an acknowledgement of that. There had been a board of investigation, but there had never been an acknowledgement of it. And it was so touching and powerful for us, in order to have the young third engineer who had just retired from Houston, from an oil company in Houston, come and be part of it. And also the children of some of the stewards department members and crew members there who had never had closure with it. And so it was a very, very touching program that we recorded the ceremony that was there and the reflections by the family members and stuff. And it was able to finally, after 45 years, no, 50 years, to finally bring closure to that family and an acknowledgement of thank you for the dedication and the work that they did. Robert, just before we close, because it's hard to believe, but we've actually been going on for 56 minutes now. And I really appreciate your time, and maybe we'll get together to do this again, because I still got to figure out what are you writing next in this. But in this discussion, we've talked about the marine electric, we've talked about the poet, we've talked about the marine self-acquaint, the poet, the marine electric, the El Faro, and being in the 8th Coast Guard District here, it's very popular to have memorandums of understandings of close relationships between the companies and the regulatory agency. As a final word, I seem to see that there's a connection between all these things. And as a final word, is there a connection, or is it just my paranoia? And second, what do we have to do to avoid the next El Faro in the future, or the next poet, or the next marine electric, or the next marine self-acquaint?
Sure. I mean, it's not a defense of owners, but American flag operators are in a tough position where you know, it's very tough for them to create new ships, and in many ways they're forced to keep the old ones. So I'm not suggesting that everything be scrapped in the American Merchant Marine, but I think the El Faro has brought a new standard where the basic safety, if the basic safety is wrong, it won't sail, and that doesn't matter whether it's a merchant ship or a military ship these days. It won't sail. That's the effect of the El Faro. The trick, of course, is to keep the inspector's mandate strong. There's an elite team within the Coast Guard called the traveling inspectors, or sometimes just the travelers. And these are the guys who really should be setting the tone. So it's important to keep them with a firm mandate. And if we can do that, I think, you know,
you mentioned in your book, Captains of Thor, that as a result of the El Faro situation, just like after the Marine Electric, 70 or so ships were scrapped. The El Faro sister ship, El Yankee, was scrapped, and then 12 other vessels. Now, personally, I'd like to know what those other 12 vessels are, because I suspect one of them was the ship that a friend of ours, captain, was on, that had holes in the hull, that they had the pumps running all the time to keep going, and then all of a sudden she just disappears. I'd like to find out what those 13 vessels were, but I may able to find that list.
Send me the ship name, and I should be able to check it out. In the meantime, I have a Freedom of Information Act request now, and it's 11th month for that information, and I may get it. I think that I will. But
I asked our local captain of the port, hey, can you get me that list? And, you know, they said there were these 13 ships, and she hasn't come back on that.
Fine. That'd be fine.
Doreen's had to run off for a phone call, but Robert, I really tremendously appreciate you joining us on this discussion. It's a very, very rich experience in the writings, and I certainly recommend to everybody your book on Until the Sea Shall Free Them, Captains of Thor, right here about the El Faro, and we never even got to the Two Tankers Down one that's there. So I guess we got to get back together again and talk. I got to read this one. I've read the other two, but I haven't read this one yet. I just got it.
I just say that if folks are interested and just want to get a sample, those books are online free at the Frump Report, and you can get a feel for them, or even read them online if you want. It's something that I think just information that needs to be out there. So they are available online. I urge you to buy them, but they are available for you online.
Well, thank you so much, and happy Day of the Seafarers. And we certainly keep in our prayers all our seafarers that they'll be safe, as well as those about 500,000 of them who are trying to get home right now will be able to get home, and that 500,000 that needs to replace them will be able to get back. Thanks so much, Robert. Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.